Hey folks, my name is Matt Klaskowski, and in this video we're going to go through the first 10 things that I went through and set up on my A7R III. I always get questions on what settings do I go in and change and whatnot, and it's obviously gonna change a little bit based on the camera because some cameras have different features. But for the A7R III specifically, these are the settings that as I got the camera, I went in there and changed. Okay, so we'll kick it off here with the first one. I think this one's pretty basic, and this is one that most people I know will go in and change right away. But it's gonna be date, time information, and copyright. I know that's kind of three different things, but this could easily been the 20 things that I set up first, but I think some of them kind of go together here. So that's why I didn't want to make it very tedious and kind of go take each one separately here. But what you can do is if you go into your menu, this one's going to be under the little suitcase. And if you go to page number 5 under a little suitcase, it's the setup, and you'll see there's a date time setup. So of course you can change your date and time. There's also copyright information in there as well. And the nice part about that is when you set your copyright info, that sticks to your image. So once you bring that photo into the computer, whatever you happen to do with it after that, that copyright information is always going to stick with that photo. So you're kind of covered right from the very get-go inside of there with getting your copyright info on there. Number 2 is going to be the file naming. Now, everybody's a little bit different in this case, okay? I know some people have some very, very specific file naming for their files, and I know based on what you shoot and maybe client expectations and storage and organization policies that you have, some people need a very, very specific file naming. Me personally, I really don't. I don't even change the names of my photos, okay? The way that I organize works for me. I know it works for a lot of other people as well. So I really don't worry too much about the file naming of my photos. The one thing I do is I will go in there, and usually a lot of cameras will set up your camera. I think it's like DSC underscore and a number, whatnot. So what I'll do is I'll usually go in there and just change that to my initials. So in my example here, is we can go into the menu, and you'll find it actually in the same place that you found the date time setup. That would be the little suitcase, page number 5, and you'll see a little place to set the file name in there. So I just set it to my initials, MJK, Matt Klaskowski, my middle initials, John, which you will never ever know, except if you were my wife or my mom when they're mad at me. Then I hear that, but that's about it. So that's something I usually go in there and set up as soon as I get a camera as well. Number 3, the next thing that I'm going to set up is going to be the file type that I'm shooting. So most cameras are going to come and they're just going to default to JPEG. So I'm going to go in there and set that to RAW. I shoot RAW almost 100% of the time. Very, very few times where I shoot JPEG, but I'm going to make sure that I go in there and I turn that camera over into RAW mode. That's going to be an easy one. It's usually pretty close to one of the first settings in your menus. So on the A7R III here, you can go up, you will see that it is under the very, very first menu, the little camera menu that's up there. And number 1, if you go straight down here, very, very first setting is file format. So I will go in there and change that to RAW. If the camera supports it, which the A7R III does, of course, I'll usually change it over into an uncompressed RAW. Just know that the file sizes are a little bit bigger, they're double. But I'll usually change it to uncompressed RAW. That gives you a little bit of a better image, especially if you're gonna start to have some wiggle room with your shadows and your highlights. When it comes to your post-production, I'll give you a little bit more leeway to have with that. Number 4 is going to be the color space. Now, you're probably thinking, why would you change this? If you watch number 3, I said I shoot RAW most of the time. So why would I change the color space? Because if you shoot RAW, and I know some people know this, some people might not know this. If you shoot RAW, your camera doesn't tag your photo with a color space. that color space doesn't get tagged until you go in and edit that raw photo and decide to do something with it. At that point, when you save it into a JPEG or a shareable format, you have to make the decision if you're gonna save it into a different color space. So in this example, I shoot raw most of the time. There are times where I shoot JPEG. So one of the things that I'll do is I'll make sure I set my JPEG quality to the largest quality possible. It's gonna be one of those things, I don't do it a lot, but this covers me. Like if I do it when I get the camera, I'm covered. I don't have to worry about being out in the field, having the need to switch over to JPEG and having to go in here and take care of all this. So I'll make sure I change it to the largest possible JPEG setting I can, which in this case would be extra fine. And then I'll go down here. It's gonna be on the next page. So the same camera icon we were on, but you're gonna go to page 2 and there's gonna be a setting for color space. So I set that to Adobe RGB, okay? The default is always gonna be sRGB, but I set it to Adobe RGB because it's just a bigger color space. So you might not always need it, but it's one of those things that's good to have it covered right from the get-go. Moving on to number 5, I bracket just about everything I shoot, especially when it comes to my landscapes. I don't really merge much HDR together. I don't really do any HDR merging, but I bracket everything because for me, I personally don't want to worry about the techie stuff out in the field. I don't want to be looking at histograms, or I want to worry too much about blinkies or whatnot. If I have a beautiful scene unfolding in front of me and the light's changing a lot, I just want to bracket, and that way I'm covered. I don't have to worry about it. I can concentrate on the creative stuff, and I don't have to worry too much about the techie stuff in the camera here. So I turn on bracketing mode. I usually set it, I'll do, -2 or 2 stops. So I'll do a 3-shot bracket where you can go in there and change that to separate by 2 stops. That's not one of the things, but it actually is one of the things. It's not necessarily a setting that's going to stick on your camera. You can change that. But I do separate them by 2 stops. But the one thing I do go in here and change for my bracketing settings is the order in which it takes and saves the photo. So what I mean by that is if you go over here to the menu, and this is gonna be on page 3 of that same camera menu that we were just on. If you go down there to bracket settings, there's something called bracket order, and the default is gonna be the metered exposure, the one that the camera would take if you didn't do anything, and then the underexposed, and then the overexposed. The problem is when I get that onto the computer later on, especially, depending on whatever program you're using. It's Lightroom for me, I'll be in the grid mode. But any program you're using, you're probably looking at your photos in a grid, and it's hard to spot those groupings when you see the exposures changing like that. So for me, I set it to minus the underexposed photo first, then the bracketed photo, then the overexposed photo. And what that does is it gives you darkest, then dark, and then bright. You basically get 3 different photos, but you can, for me, it just helps me spot them a little bit easier. So as I'm looking through that grid, I can spot the groupings of the brackets because I know it's gonna be the darkest one, and then the next brightest one, and then the next brightest one. And that to me is a good way to spot the groupings inside of there. The next setting that I turned on my my A7R III here, and this is something that I usually turn on any camera that I can turn it on, is going to be the display quality. So if there's a chance to have a better display quality, I want it. So this one's under the suitcase, page number 2. So set up page number 2, and you'll see there's an option in there for display quality. I went ahead and I've set that one to high. Going along in that same section of the menu there, it'd be the suitcase icon, setup number 2. The other thing that I set is touch operation. So on the A7R III, and this was a big reason that I upgraded to the A7R III, is it's got the touch screen. And as a landscape photographer, if you were to imagine my camera on a tripod here, as I want to change focus points depending on my composition of the scene, of course I could use the joystick to do it, which is another nice feature that I swung me over to the A7R III. But the other thing is to just be able to touch the screen. So as I'm, standing back, or if I'm crouched down, or whatever it happens to be, I can just look at the scene on the back of my camera, and I can just touch, basically just tap on whatever they want the camera to focus on. So that's one of the things that, as soon as I got this camera, I made sure I went in and turned it on. Moving on, the next thing that I went in here and changed is going to be anything that has to do with Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, my phone, any of those settings. So I'm kind of lumping a few of them into one place in here. Anything that's got to do with Wi-Fi or Bluetooth connectivity. This is one of those things that, and I found this from experience, if I don't do it when I get the camera, if I don't make it a point to really sit down and do this, it's going to be one of those things that burns me in the field later on. So as an example, there's a way to send a photo directly to your phone, right from the camera. Okay. Now, I've had cameras where I've just been lazy and I've gotten the camera and I haven't set that up. And you can guarantee the one time I really want to use it, the one time I'm out in the field and I really want to share a photo directly, like right away, I take it, I'm like, oh, cool. I can pop it on my phone and do a quick edit and share it right away. You can guarantee I have forgotten to set that transfer process up. And the one thing that I can always tell you is it's much harder to do at that point. None of the settings make sense when you're trying to do it fast and all that. So I try to set that stuff up as soon as I can. So you're going to find that if you head over to your menu, go to the little globe icon, that's network. Network page number 1, I turn on the send to smartphone function. I don't really turn on send to computer. The other one I turned on was control with smartphone, and that uses the Sony Play Memories app on your phone. And then the other thing that I turned on, and this is a big one, is Bluetooth settings. By turning on Bluetooth settings and pairing that to your phone, it will capture GPS data. So your photos will actually have GPS as long as your phone is nearby and you've set this all up. Your camera will use your phone, and as you're taking a picture, it'll tag the GPS info to it. So those are some of the things that as soon as I got the camera, some of them were new, but the GPS setting was new, for example, but as soon as I got the camera, I made sure I set that stuff up because I can tell you I've been burned by it time and time again. I'm forcing myself whenever I get a camera to make sure I set it up right away. The next one that I went in there and changed as soon as I got the camera is the brightness of the screen and the viewfinder. Okay, I like it bright. I want things to be bright. These screens are so good. There's so much detail in them, especially with Sony. It's a very digital camera. It's a very digital experience, and that's what I like about it. So the electronic viewfinder, I like, what you see is what you get. And so one of the things I jump in here and do is under that little suitcase icon, it's basically setup page 1, monitor brightness and viewfinder brightness. I made sure I turned them both to manual. Some of them have some auto settings, and I don't want it to automatically change based on the light. I usually always want it to stay the same. So I make sure I turn off all auto settings, keep it at manual, and then I went in to each menu and you can bump up the brightness a little bit. So I went in there and bumped it up a couple of notches, and that way for me personally, I like a nice bright screen. I want to be able to see, especially if I'm out and it's a little bit bright outside. It just helps me see everything a lot better. And the last thing that I changed on the Sony A7R III, and this is by no means limited to the A7R III. This is every camera, that is the volume. Don't be that guy. Right? Don't be that person that's got the volume turned up, and especially if you got timer mode on or whatever, and you hear beep, 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 and you hear that, as you're focusing and all these things. So go ahead and turn your volume down on the camera. Of course, there's certain reasons you might want to have the volume up. By all means, you can be that person, but one of the things that I always do when I get a camera is I usually jump in here, I turn the volume down, and if for some reason I do need it on, I'll maybe keep it up at the very, very first notch, but you can jump in there. You're gonna find that under your menu. Again, that's gonna be in the same little suitcase menu setup, page number 1, and if you go down there to close to the bottom, you can jump in there and change the volume settings right on the camera, okay? Guys, hope that helped. Just a peek into some of the things that I went in when I got the A7R III and made sure I changed right away. And hope you enjoyed. We'll talk to you again real soon.